For another installment of our Brownbag talk series here at the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies. It is my special pleasure to welcome our guest speaker today. Before going on to introduce him, I would like just to, first of all, ask everyone to please think of Justina and wish her well, because she's having a bad cold, and we'd like to make sure she has the speediest recovery possible.
Thank you so much.
And also would like to thank everyone for being here despite this being Thanksgiving week, and I know that a lot of us are already full of anticipation of all the wonderful things that Thanksgiving brings, so thank you for being here with us today. Just a couple of heads up about upcoming events. We have 2 more Brownbag lectures left this semester. One of them will be for our own Eric Scott, Professor of History Department and Director of Graduate Studies for Global and International Studies Program. And this will have to do with his recent research for his new book. And then, so that will be on November 28th, a week from today, and then 2 weeks from today, our final Brownbag lecture of the semester will be by Michelle Smirnova, who is a sociologist at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and it'll be her first time on campus. And she is a sociologist who researches jokes. So I think it will be a very fun and appropriate way of wrapping up a semester. So one of the things she studies is political humor. And in our interesting times, political humor could be a very good topic for discussion indeed. Other events I'd like to alert everyone to include our next FLAS information session. Especially, please share this with students who might be interested in applying for FLAS fellowships for next academic year. So that will be on next Thursday, so a week from Thanksgiving Day at 4 p.m. And then also at Thursday, at 7 p.m. in this very room, we will have a screening of a wonderful film by one of the leading living film directors of the region that we study, Kira Muratova. This is her film Melody for a Street Organ, which came out in 2009. And it has never been, even though it won multiple awards at festivals, commercially released in this country. So you'll have a very, very rare and exclusive opportunity to see this film with English subtitles. And then, of course, customary, we will have our stop day meeting on Friday, December 8th, here in this room at 10 a.m., which will have a chance for all of us to pause at the end of the semester and reflect at what it has brought us. And our traditional winter holiday mixer will be on Saturday the 9th. And I'd like everyone to please note the change of venue. For a variety of reasons, we've had to move it, and it will be at the Adams Alumni Center. And please note that by the rules of Adams Alumni Center, we are not allowed to bring outside food or drink. So while in the past this has been a potluck event, this time it will have to be a catered event. So if you have cookies or other delectables you'd like to share, bring them to the stop day. So here everyone is encouraged to contribute, but we have to play by the rules of the Adams Alumni Center on Saturday the 9th. So this is the highlights of some of the upcoming events. And for now, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our guest speaker today, Karlis Verdins, who is a renowned Latvian poet and a researcher at the Institute of Literature, Folklore, and Art at the University of Latvia. He has published 5 collections of poetry in Latvian. Is that correct? So, and numerous scholarly publications on Latvian and world literature, in Latvian and in English, including his monograph on the prose poem. I have here, his poetry has also been translated into multiple other languages, and I have here two of his books. One is a bilingual book in English and original Latvian called Come to Me, in English translation, which came out in 2015, and I'll be happy to pass that around. And the other one is a book of his poems in Russian translation, which came out earlier, so in 2003, so it represents an earlier stage in our guest's literary career, but also is quite interesting. And last but not least, I would like to acknowledge him and his co-editor, Jānis Ozoļiņš, who is here for putting together this wonderful book, Queer Stories of Europe, which resulted from a conference they co-organized in Riga in the summer of 2015, which was a truly outstanding event, one of the best, if not the best, conference I have attended in the post-Soviet region, both in terms of intellectual rigor, excitement about topics discussed, and overall quality of memories that have been wonderful and long-lasting from that event. And as for the title of the lecture, you have it in front of you on the screen. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming our speaker today, Karlis Verdins.
Hello, nice to meet you, and thank you, Vitaly, for your generous introduction. What I am doing besides writing poetry is trying to do research on Latvian queer history, Latvian history of sexuality and gender constructions in representations of them, and my topic will be just another chapter in this research, and it deals with something that might be familiar to American people, Latvian diaspora in North America in the time of the Cold War. And last year, studying in the Washington University in St. Louis, I became interested in so-called small state theory, small state studies, because as you can imagine, I have always been asked, where are you from? And then I answer, I am from Europe. But where exactly in Europe? Eastern Europe. Okay, but where exactly in Eastern Europe? And then I say, I am from Latvia. And then I look at people's faces, and sometimes they just say, oh, very interesting. And sometimes they start to tell me, oh, I have been to Riga. Riga is a beautiful city, or I have a Latvian friend, or I have traveled to a conference in Estonia, or yes, Balkans are such a nice region, or is it close to Spain? And I think this small state studies, it's a field that speaks to the world in the name of all these strange, obscure countries that nobody actually knows what to do. And I think I'll get to the point. Small State Studies is a division of political studies which was established after the Second World War. During the 20th century, changes in the world's political map led to the succession of the former empires: Austro-Hungarian Empire, Russian Empire, German Empire, and Ottoman Empire. And new national countries were established in Europe. After the Second World War, many former European colonies in Africa became independent states, and after the collapse of the USSR and the fall of Iron Curtain, another changes in political map took place. Thus, the number of small states has grown significantly during the 20th century, and the existence of these countries created new challenges in world's politics. There are many definitions and criteria of the small states. Most commonly, a state is considered small if it has a relatively small population and territory. Sometimes also GNP has been added to criteria. Usually, small state is defined as a state which do not have military, political, and economic resources to be able to fight any of the superpowers or other bigger states in an open military conflict. So its existence and sovereignty can be easily questioned. Power dynamics in world politics is often described in gendered language. The big powers are usually associated with life, masculinity, success. They are feared by others and can employ opportunistic tactics to reach their goals, whereas the small states are described as weak, emasculated or feminine, close to death. The process of their loss of sovereignty is compared to tragedy. They are expected to act morally and still can be betrayed by larger states. What unites them all is the performative nature of these divisions. Big powers are performing their greatness, aggressive attitude in foreign affairs, expansionist and belligerent politics, almost unlimited military and economic resources to fulfill their goals, while small states smallness is also seen as something that a small country should perform. Its relationship with other states has to be highly moral. It should enter in different alliances controlled by bigger states to be able to protect its sovereignty. In a case of military conflict, it cannot criticize the bigger countries too harsh to avoid sanctions or other revenge because it would not be able to deal with them. The discourse of states' femininity can be employed also in such big country as United Kingdom. As Sarah Ahmed shows, right-wing extremists in their advocacy for anti-immigrant politics have used the narrative of the nation as a feminized body which is penetrated or invaded by others. Speaking about the small states, the discourse of femininity is present in different scholars' work and gets employed speaking about, for example, the states lacking military capacity that prevents its army to fight the aggressor, or as well as the high percentage of women diplomats and young people in the diplomatic services of the new post-socialist small states. Small state studies and their implied gender constructions are useful, speaking also about the exile diaspora of the small state. Ex-citizens of the small state transplanted to a different country still carry with themselves their understanding of the power dynamics among big and small states, and their identity is always under questioned because of the obscure nature of their place of origin. And as Sarah Ahmed states in her book, The Cultural Politics of Emotion, it is possible to explore queer feelings without translating such an exploration into a matter of feeling queer. So if you are a person from a small state in exile or in diaspora, there are ways how to make you queer or almost like queer, even if you are not like queer in a sexual way or gendered way. And some of these features could be explained as you have to explain yourself constantly, you have to pass as somebody from here, or you are being as not being from here, and questions about your origin will arise sooner or later. And another thing is this sense of displacement. You know, after the Second World War, refugees were called displaced persons, and this sense of displacement is also something very, very prominent in exile culture, exile literature. So, and it all makes these two things, queerness and exile or diaspora, somehow speaking to each other. And in 1950s, queer-related content in the biggest Latvian exile newspapers like Latvia America and Australia's Latvijas usually appeared as a part of foreign affairs, especially when they were covering Cold War spy scandals where homosexual spies were involved. In 1960s, questions of decriminalization of male homosexual relationships in several Western countries was the most prominent topic. At the end of the 60s, queer-related themes in popular culture, cinema and arts exploded, making their presence much more prominent in Latvian periodicals as well. However, this presence was marked as something unwelcomed and alien to the Latvian community. Latvian immigrants in North America define their identity as something unique and different from other kinds of minorities, for example, African Americans or American LGBT community. In Latvian newspapers and books, the occupation of Latvia was seen as unfair, comparing to the new established post-colonial states in Africa. Latvians were seen as an ethnicity somehow superior to black Africans and more deserving to have their own sovereign state. Similarly, LGBT movement in the 70s and 80s was seen not only as something ideologically threatening to the heterosexual purity of the Latvian nation, but even as a physical competitor for the attention of American society. When Canadian political activist John Sewell became the mayor of Toronto in 1978, Latvians wrote him to protest for his support for the LGBT movement and his indifference to the activities of the Baltic communities in exile and other ethnic minorities. Such letter by a 15-year-old Arnis Markitans, identified as a dancer of Latvian folk dance group Daugaviņa in Toronto, was published in the Toronto Sun on February 13 and later republished in Latvian exile newspapers. As a good example, other youths should follow, thus confirming the conservative stand of the majority of the Latvian exiles. Similar competition was reported taking place on June 14, 1984, in the center of Boston, when the representatives of the exile communities of Baltic states were holding a demonstration to commemorate the mass deportations of 1941 with speeches addressed to the Western world and raised national flags. As Latvian exile newspaper Latvia America complained, this beautifully opened act was disturbed by a demonstration of homosexuals on the other side of the square who were fighting for their rights and releasing hundreds of purple balloons in the air. TV started to film them and forgot about the demonstration of bolts. Well, such confrontation makes one think that nationalism for Latvians is the same that sex is for homosexuals and sex sells, but nationalism in that package not always sells, so Latvians are losers to gay people, and of course it's terrible. Latvian emigre literary culture in English-speaking countries from 1915 to 19 represented mostly the immigrants which left Latvia for Germany's DP camps at the end of the Second World War, fleeing the coming Soviet occupation, and arrived in their new countries around 1950. The body of immigrants consisted mostly of people in their 20s, 30s and 40s, as well as their children and sometimes parents. A part of them were young men who had been drafted into Nazi Germany's SS legions under compulsion during the Second World War. This generation was the most active and influential demographic group of Latvian exiles, as they had graduated from Latvian schools either in Latvia or in Germany's DP camps and were less influenced by assimilation. Writers, artists and actors who continued their creative work in exile, identifying with Latvian culture, mostly belonged to this generation. The number of second-generation Latvian writers and artists was considerably smaller. And this is my main hero of today, Latvian exile writer, Anšlaus Eglītis. He rose to prominence as a prose writer in the second half of the 30s in Latvia, when his sharp and entertaining short stories and novels about urban Riga people, most frequently artists and their milieu, made him one of the most important voices of the new generation. Eglītis, inspired by the Anglophone culture, presented himself as dandy and admirer of wild and the art, poor art, doctrine. 30 years later, we find him in Los Angeles, continuously working on new books, mostly novels, as well as reviewing Hollywood movies for the biggest newspaper for Latvian Americans, Laiks. His readers have been aging together with him, as the second generation of exiled Latvians were not increasing their numbers substantially. After the period of parliamentary democracy from 1920 to 1934, the political climate of the Republic of Latvia changed when Karlis Ulmanis became its authoritarian leader after a coup d'etat. Not as violent as other regimes of the interwar Europe, Ulmanis' authoritarianism prohibited political parties, significantly reduced the freedom of speech, and closed all left-wing organizations and press publications. It positioned itself against modernity, urbanism, and industrialization, offering the ideal of a traditional peasant farm and traditional family, with the father as a breadwinner and the mother as a housewife. Latvian immigrants surviving the following Soviet occupation of 1940 and the Second World War and Nazi occupation often defined the 6 years of the authoritarian regime as the ultimate achievement of Latvian history. Their attitude towards such issues as morality and sexuality also seemed to be fixated on Ulmanis times. Their conservative worldview was drastically challenged by the sexual revolution, as well as the human rights movements of the 60s, including the Black Liberation Movement, as well as the rise of LGBT activism. Conservative Latvian American writers and journalists saw the ubiquitous representation of sexuality as a threat to the comparatively pure and simple morals of Latvian émigrés. Already in 1955, critic Jānis Grīns lamented that modern Western writers, for example, Proust, Joyce, Woolf, Sartre, Faulkner, Camus, Beckett, Henry Miller, and Genet, and their desire for subjects previously untouched in literature. Among these subjects were, quote, the inner depths accenting the existential drives of evil and fear of encountering death, homosexual and other perverse drives, psychological processes of schizophrenics and paranoics, etc. Unquote. In a similar manner, Latvian essayist and philosopher Pauls Jurevich, in his book The World of Countries, contemplated the main challenges provided by the contemporary world to the Latvian intellectual: shaking of all values, thriving of materialism, spread of communism, dominance of the power of sex, and intergenerational conflicts. In his essay, Literature and the Cult of Sex, he accuses the depraved West of making such authors as Havelock Ellis, D.H. Lawrence, H.G. Wells, Freud, Krafft Ebing, de Sade, Maupassant, Arthur Miller, Nabokov, Gide, and Aldous Huxley too easy accessible to the average reader, thus assaulting their morality. He too made the distinction between the pure, valuable, and unified tradition of Latvian literature and the degeneration of the modern West. As it can be seen in these two cases, Latvian authors defined their cultural and national identity against what they took to be the emerging Western canon of modern literature and thought. As years passed and Latvian exiles adjusted to the conditions of their countries of residence, Latvian writers had to acknowledge the ever-widening gap between their literary school of interwar Latvia and the contemporary modern Western literature that became more and more familiar to their readers. The topic of homosexuals and transvestites in literary works became the unwanted sign of modernity for them, something they felt obliged to incorporate in their own works, and at the same time was most unwilling to do so. Anšlaus Eglītis, in his novel Nav tak dzimtene, Not Your Homeland, depicts the contemplation of Latvian exile writer Turaids, his alter ego, on this matter. And you can see here the main question: which tradition to break and which prejudice to abolish? And he comes to conclusion that actually no traditions should be broken. Let's stick to what we have, to our purity. And yeah, you can also see that the community of exile gets more conservative and like living in their fortress of morality, and alternative ways of life are very, very like they're not like being around there. And if they care to be famous, to have any resonance in world literature, so they feel kind of obliged to write in a similar manner than these depraved Western writers. At the same time, they wouldn't do that because they are morally pure. And whenever Eglīt's protagonist steps out of their comfort zone, the risk to come across something that doesn't correspond to their morality, for example, reading the advertisement page in his local newspaper. However, instead of turning away in disgust, the writer takes time to become acquainted with the supposed filth in order to be able to lament its existence at some length. And this is a passage from his novel, Shameless Old Man, and his protagonist is reading this advertisement page and feeling utterly shocked for what he sees there. At the same time, he is kind of also fascinated to find out more what's really happening in America. Eglīts mixes sexuality and politics, showing his supposed disgust to these things. It should have been easy for his readers to identify with such opinion, as they shared the same cultural background and experience of the authoritarian state and occupation regimes, which defined obscenity and filth in ways that left not much space for choices. In the same novel, Bezkaunīgie veči, Shameless Old Man, whose protagonist was an elderly Latvian exile man, overwhelmed by thoughts of aging and trying to change his habits to have more fun. His family is worried and seeks help at a doctor. However, doctors have changed a lot in the last years and attack the family with questions about her father's suspected homosexuality. Modern medicine, as Eglīts wants his readers to believe, has made the ubiquitous queerness into something fashionable. So the first thing the doctor is asking to the family is, probably your father is just becoming homosexual, and this is the problem with him and nothing else. And as Eglīts shows, it's ridiculous to attribute any signs of homosexual behavior to an elderly heterosexual middle-class Latvian, a defender of traditional family and patriarchy. The comic effect should be produced by the doctor's dumb preoccupation with sexual matters. And this passage is very long. I'm sorry for that, but it's also very telling. So now he's pretending, if he would write like one of these depraved Western writers, what his literature would look like. He takes his protagonists to this hotel called motel called Seven Storms, and as you can see, all kind of sexual and racial prejudices is taking place in this passage, and the most interesting is how it ends. This writer reads what he has just written and finds out that this was pure socialist realism. It was exactly how the Soviet grand writers, titled and decorated with orders, following the instructions of the party, were depicting the capitalist everyday life and the representatives of the bourgeoisie. So if you try to go to explore this mysterious American life, then you end up as a socialist realist. This is something very unexpected, but at the same time, just one way how to say to his readers that no, we shouldn't go to this direction. Let's stick to our Latvian exile culture, to our middle-class values, and let's not pay attention to anything else, because this is all leading to socialism, to communism, and we can't just do that. And in the mid-50s, Eglītis started his prolific career as a movie critic. And I will show you these pictures. They're not that relevant to what I'm speaking about, but I just couldn't help. I just wanted to share them with you. Eglītis reviews on the new films were published in the biggest Latvian American newspaper Laiks and often republished in the Latvian Australian newspaper Austrālijas Latvietis. For several decades he was the mediator between the Hollywood film industry and the Latvian reader, at least the part of Latvian readers which prefer to read criticism of American movies written by their compatriot. During these years he had gathered an impressive collection with photos of him posing together with Hollywood stars, intended to prove that he has really met them for interviews. And for me, I feel like I'm losing my mind looking at these pictures, because for me they represent two totally different worlds. This aging, conservative Latvian exile community and these young, sexy Hollywood stars who are like shining together with old Anschlaus. In his reviews, Eglītis stuck to the morals of bourgeoisie as well. At the 60s proceeded, he witnessed more and more prominent queer characters appearing on screen. In his reviews, they always fell under the category of perversity. Their presence in the movie was always stressed as something problematic, uncomfortable, threatening the public moral and taste. For example, as you can see from this quote, he's depicting this process as this queerness is coming, it's overcoming the film industry, and they're changing the way how we're looking at this world, and it's always something really negative. This Staircase is a gay comedy drama of an elderly couple of hairdressers and their strained relationship. And Eglītis shifts between repulsion and admiration seeing the gay couple on screen. He writes, "The plot often becomes disgusting, but the performance of the actors is refined and sophisticated." Unquote. However, at the same time, the presence of perversions in the movie is somewhat less prominent than he would have expected. He writes, "From the erotic point of view, the film follows the rules of quite old-fashioned taste. It is a game of purely psychological dialogues, and for long periods of time makes us to forget that both squabblers has their abnormalities." Unquote. In his another review of Midnight Cowboy, after praising the acting of Dustin Hoffman and John Voight and advising the protagonists to find a job instead of living their miserable life, he concludes, "After watching the film, you want to ask what really was the purpose of the novelist, screenwriter, producer, and director in constructing this artificial story." So everything under the middle-class respectability seems for him just useless to describe, including queer life of New York. And as in other reviews, queerness is just one of the vices of the vagabonds, hippies, hitchhikers, drug users, political extremists, sex workers, and other people who do not do proper work. However, Eglītis seems to be more irritated when queerness tends to come into the space of bourgeois respectability. This movie, Sunday Bloody Sunday, it's a British movie, and it is a love triangle drama where a young and handsome sculptor has relationships with his two lovers, a man and a woman. And yeah, you can see this pedagogical introduction of how these motives of homosexualism entered the mainstream cinema. And actually, fascinated by the gay love story, Eglītis is barely interested in the other lover of the sculptor. The woman is just mentioned in a passing remark, while there is a detailed account of what exactly two male lovers are seen doing and how they show their affection. Eglītis irritably says, in this film a normalization of gay characters, for they are shown as child-loving people whose love life is inseparable from their professional work and daily routine. This all would suggest their normality. Eglītis finishes his review with an open question, as always, of whether the whole idea of the film is acceptable. And if this was something that Latvian community in exile was able to read, then Eglītis writes something different in a private letter to the director of San Francisco Small Latvian Theatre, Laimonis Siliņš, after he sees his production of The Zoo Story by Edward Albee. And in this letter, we see Eglītis as a huge expert of a gay underground scene. He explains to Siliņš what does it really mean when they speak about cats and dogs and vegetables or animals. He sees this all as a closeted way how to speak about gay subculture, and at the same time, his expertise is something very secret, and this is not supposed to go public. And he ends his letter with this upper quote: "Be careful, because somebody might decipher these things and begin to defame the small theater, because Latvian public is in exile, is so conservative that you better try to be quiet about these homoerotic undertones of this production." And the lower quote you see is a part of his review published in a Latvian exile newspaper, and in this review he avoids to mention all these homoerotic things in this play and also in this production, and he's actually shaming Latvian exile community, that Latvians, you love just very old-fashioned, very stupid Latvian plays with stupid jokes, but instead of that, let's attend these productions of this contemporary play, because it's so valuable and we all need to move on, and not to Latvian theater cannot be held under the wing of nationalism forever. So there is this reaction to this homoeroticism that it's still like left under the carpet, but at the same time it stands for like a new and exciting future for Latvian exile theater as something more valuable than theater in occupied Soviet Latvia, because it's worse by default. And another view at Anšlaus sexuality is revealed when another Latvian exile writer and painter, Raimons Staprāns, publishes his play Anšlaus and Veronika. And basically all he does in this play is queering Anšlaus, Eglītis, and his spouse of long years, artist and painter and writer Veronika Janelsiņa, and this couple is depicted as they never sleep in the same bed, because Anšlaus feels disgust towards woman's body, and if they are forced to sleep in the same bed, then Veronika apologizes to her husband for just having to sleep next to each other. And Veronika is accused of masculinity. She wears pants with a zipper in front of them, and her like friends are very suspicious about what are your relationship is exactly all about if you wear such pants. And Veronika complains to Anšlaus that people are gossiping of her as a lesbian because of these perverse pants with the zipper, and because of Anšlaus novels, because all women in Anšlaus novels are actually with a very masculine sensibility, and they don't have these female hormones. They have just pure intellect. So they resemble men and not women. And yeah, so we are tempted to see their marriage as fake or just cover for something else, but we are never told what was this something else in their marriage. And and the last thing is that Eglītis has a very pale skin, so he is using brown makeup when he goes out of his house to seem less pale and less like more pretty. So, and thinking about this relationship of queerness as a sexual thing and queerness as a part of identity of a small state diaspora exile person, you can see these different roles which Eglītis takes as a famous writer and opinion leader of this small Latvian diaspora. And yeah, I'm going to continue my research to explore more what is really at stake here, how these different ideological standpoints are mixing in his creative work, and how he is speaking to his readers, actually never revealing his private views, just trying to be this moral how to say, expert on morality, and always knowing better what is right and what is wrong for other people. Okay, this is, I think, more or less what I wanted to tell you.
All right. Thank you so much, Mike.